American urban life has been transformed over the last 50 years by a steady drop in violent crime. 2014 marked the lowest level of violent crime in decades. But it was also the year that Eric Garner was arrested for the petty crime of selling single cigarettes and put into a chokehold which killed him. Patrick Sharkey's book, Uneasy Peace, examines how a lack of investment in low-income communities in favor of the increased presence of law enforcement and investment in criminal justice has contributed to a serious problem of inequality which needs to be addressed. Patrick Sharkey is the chair of the Department of Sociology at NYU and scientific director of Crime Lab New York, an independent organization dedicated to applying and evaluating new methods for addressing crime, violence, and poverty. Please join me now in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
Thanks. Thanks for that introduction. It is fun to be here. Do you want me up or down? Doesn't matter. Okay. And thank you all for coming. I'm really grateful to have you all here. This is. I love this place. I spent a lot of time here when I used to live in D.C., so this is really a thrill to be here, and I'm glad to be invited. What I thought I would do is spend a few minutes. I kind of want to have a conversation, but I'll first just pull out a few of the big points from the book and kind of give you the origin story from the book to start. So this book started, well, the work on this started almost 10 years ago. And it actually, so I've been working on it for a long time, but it started at a very precise moment. It started, let me give you this little tangent to give you a sense of how I got here. I was sitting in a course on epigenetics, and epigenetics is the study of how to put this, how the functioning of our genes is affected by our environments, by our experiences. Okay, and so I was just sitting in on this lecture, and during the course of the lecture, the instructor mentioned a series of studies by a neuroscientist. The neuroscientist was named David Diamond. He studies how rats respond to stress, like a lot of neuroscientists. So what they do is they put them through, these assessments of cognitive skills like water mazes and teach them how to get through the maze, see how long it takes them, then put them under conditions of stress and see how that affects their cognitive function. That's kind of a common approach in neuroscience. What Diamond does is somewhat unique. The way he induces stress is he puts a cat or cats outside the rat's cage. And as it turns out, when rats are subjected to this kind of threat, when they fear for their lives, when they see a predator nearby, then when you put them in a water maze, they have trouble. They have trouble focusing. They make more mistakes as they go through the maze. They take longer to get through the maze, okay? And so I was listening to this, and this was the early part of my career, and all the work that I've been doing had focused on how kids are affected when they grow up in very poor neighborhoods, how their academic performance is affected, how their cognitive development is affected, ultimately how their economic outcomes are affected. But I consistently run into a question of why, what was going on in these neighborhoods? What was it about growing up in a very poor neighborhood that had such a big impact on kids? What was happening there? And so the moment that this book started, I was sitting in that course, and I had this thought that maybe this might give us a hint about what's going on in Chicago, where I was doing most of my research. Maybe when kids are navigating through streets where they're worried about getting jumped, getting assaulted, maybe this is what affects them when they get in the classroom, or maybe this is part of the answer. So from there, I tried to do research to figure out whether that is part of the answer. And my big goal was to get very precise estimates, to try to figure out exactly. I focused on situations where kids were given assessments of cognitive skills, the stuff that you get in an IQ test, academic achievement tests, high-stakes tests. And I looked for situations where kids were assessed by chance, either right before or right after major incidents of violence had taken place. And that was my initial strategy. So the first study I did was in Chicago, and I looked at kids who were given these sets of assessments verbal, language, reading ability, problem-solving ability. And some of the kids, by chance, were given these assessments just before a homicide had taken place right down the street. Some of the kids from the same neighborhood were given the assessments just after. And when I made that comparison, that was my first hint that violence is a big part of the reason of what's going on. The kids who took the assessment right after looked as if they had missed about 2 years of schooling. So their performance on these assessments dropped by about 2 years. The impact was so large. Now, we all know that violence is damaging, okay? That's not a shock. The magnitude of the impact was completely surprising to me. I thought it was wrong. So we replicated that first study, and the second time we did it, the effect was larger than the first one. Okay, in subsequent years, this finding has come up over and over by people who look at the timing of incidents of violence. There's been work done in Mexico during periods of intense gang violence, in Colombia. Actually, one of the best studies is from the period of the Beltway sniper shootings here in D.C. Now, if you remember that time, I had just left D.C. actually when that happened, but if you remember that time, the entire east coast of the country was focused on this series of completely random shootings. And there's a great study that looks at kids in Virginia schools actually, and makes comparisons among kids who, again, by chance, happen to live near the site of one of the shootings. It makes comparisons to kids in identical schools that were a little further away, and finds a sharp decline in academic performance during the period of the sniper shootings. So these are all hints as to what happens in violent environments. And what we've found in the years since is that when kids are exposed to violence in their community, it affects their sleep, it affects their stress levels, it affects their ability to maintain focus, to concentrate when they're taking an assessment, to control their impulses, and it ultimately affects their academic performance. So this was the starting point. This was my hint that if I wanted to understand urban inequality, then violence was a key part of the answer. Now I say this, I call this the origin story. It would be much more compelling, and it always is much more compelling if an author has a personal experience that kind of inspires the book. So it would be better if I got jumped or assaulted and had this epiphany about the impact of, or if I was raised in a violent neighborhood. So none of that happened to me. You've got a white guy with red hair, raised in the suburbs for the most part, and I'm talking to you about violence. That's the situation we're in. So that is kind of, it's hard for me to make the case that this is a personal project. This is a project that has drawn my passion over the years, but it has, and I think part of the reason is, well, I was raised by two public school educators. Two of their best friends in the world are here tonight. And they kind of instilled a value very early about the importance of devoting our professional lives to confronting injustice, to confronting inequality. And that's kind of become my focus as an academic. I believe strongly in the idea that my career is devoted to understanding and confronting inequality. And this is, for me, this was kind of, it wasn't a personal epiphany, it was kind of an empirical epiphany, that if we want to understand urban inequality, then we should start with violent crime. Violent crime, the more I've studied it, the more hints I've gotten that this is the key, this is the fundamental problem of cities. Nothing else happens if cities are violent. So when you think about city life, well, in cities, we prioritize public spaces. These are places where we come together, okay? City life doesn't work. That ideal doesn't work if public spaces are unsafe. So that's kind of, this book is about the drop in violence, but the piece that I hope stands out is that violence is just more destructive than we imagine. Violence doesn't just affect victims. It affects every kid within a community. It affects the decision of families to invest in a neighborhood. It affects whether a teacher is going to commit to a school district, whether business owners will set up shop, whether people venture out to a bookstore to hear a talk, whether residents will venture out to a public park or a library. Okay, so violence is for me, the more I've done violence, I see violence as a fundamental challenge, the fundamental problem of American cities. Now, saying that, as I was doing this research for several years, trying to really generate rigorous estimates of the impact of violence, I had this realization at some point that the problem was getting much less severe. So things were getting better. And that's a good thing, except when your career is focused on that problem. So let me give a scale, a sense of the scale of change that we've seen. This is since 1991. Think about 1991, 1992, 93. Those were the latest peak of violence in the U.S. And since that time, the level of violence has fallen almost by half. Okay, the greatest changes have taken place in cities. So there are violence has fallen in almost every big city across the country. There are exceptions. There's one exception, 45 minutes north of here in Baltimore. But these are the anomalies. Violence has fallen almost everywhere across the country. And then in many major urban cities, urban areas, places like D.C., places like New York, L.A., Dallas, Fort Worth, San Diego, these cities have completely transformed. Violence has fallen by 75% or more. And so what I argue is that the nature of city life has changed. For several decades, cities were associated with violence. Violence was a central feature of city life in the U.S., and that's no longer true. There are still extremely violent places, but if we look across the country, those are the anomalies. There aren't many of them left. Okay, there's still certainly violent neighborhoods, but again, those are the anomalies even within cities. Okay. So this is very visible to a lot of us. If you live in D.C., you've kind of seen this transformation take place. There used to be almost 500 homicides each year in D.C. Now there are usually somewhere between 100 and 150. My brother-in-law is an officer in D.C. He still complains about the crime that's here, but it's a totally different environment than when he started back in the 1980s. What is less visible, at least to most of the folks in this room, is the changes that have taken place in the most disadvantaged segments of urban America. And what I show in the book is that violence has transformed, the fall of violence has transformed every urban space, but the greatest changes have taken place in the most disadvantaged places, in the most segregated neighborhoods. And the greatest benefits of the crime drop have gone in the most disadvantaged segments of the population. So I make this case in several different ways in the book. The most obvious way is to look at lives that have been preserved. We do an analysis where we look at how the crime drop isn't typically thought of as a public health issue. Well, we find that it's probably the most important public health advancement for black men in the past several decades. Just been an enormous change in life expectancy that has been driven by the crime drop. It's done more than save lives. It has made schools safer. Victimization in schools, as reported by 12 to 18-year-olds, has fallen by about 75% since the early 1990s. So back in the 90s, surveys asking kids whether they carried a weapon to school used to show that black and Latino kids had were 2 to 3 times more likely to acknowledge carrying a weapon to school than whites. Now there's no difference. Okay, there's no gap. African American kids have the lowest rates of carrying weapons to school. So there's been a transformation in schools. The places, at least at a descriptive level, the places that have seen the biggest drop in violence have seen the biggest improvements in academic achievement. They've also seen the biggest narrowing of the racial achievement gap. So we've had impacts on public health, on education. We have an analysis of economic mobility. We've seen families returning to neighborhoods where poverty is concentrated. So I have an analysis with a doctoral student named Gerard Torres Espinosa at NYU, where we find a causal effect on the concentration of poverty driven by the crime drop. We find a similar impact on economic mobility. So the kids who start in poor families have a greater chance of moving upward out of poverty if they live in places where crime has fallen. And beyond all of that, I think for me, what's one of the most important byproducts of the crime drop is the change in the daily experience of urban poverty. So we have, for anyone who's taken a course on urban poverty, you've read the classics, William Julius Wilson's work, the work of Elijah Anderson, who wrote a book called Code of the Street, which was based in Philadelphia and just described how the daily interactions of young people in Philadelphia were dominated by the threat of violence. This was done in the 1990s, and all of this work, not all of it, but let me say the classics of urban poverty, the stuff that is still taught in seminars in sociology departments on urban poverty, most of it is based on work that was done at a time when violence was rising or when violence was extremely high. Okay, the changes that have taken place since then are sufficient, I think, to provoke a rethinking of what urban poverty means. Urban poverty has changed in the last 25 years in a way that I think hasn't quite made its way through the population. We still have images of urban poverty that are remnants of a time when U.S. cities had levels of violence that are typically only found in the most violent nations of the world. That's not true anymore to a large extent. Again, there are exceptions. There are still extremely violent cities, but they are rare now. 20 years ago, about half of major urban centers had extreme rates of violence, homicide rates over 20 per 100,000. That's true for only a handful of cities across the country now. It's true for about 10% of cities at this point. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that we really we need to rethink the meaning of urban poverty, and we need to have a new discussion about what urban poverty means. Because as crime has fallen, it has changed the entire discussion around violence. Americans used to have very punitive attitudes. They used to want to punish criminals, and what's interesting is as violence has fallen, those attitudes have changed. Our level of punitiveness has declined just as the crime rate has declined. So I find that interesting. I think it's enough of a change that it should really push us to emphasize how much of a transformation there has been, and really try to change the dialogue around what urban poverty means. Now, the last thing I'll say is this is, to this point, I think this is maybe too much of a feel-good story. We all kind of know that this hasn't happened in a vacuum. I think our dominant approach to dealing with crime and violence in this country has been dominated by our reliance on the police and the prison system. And I don't want to deny that. That's a huge part of the story here. What it means is that just as the greatest benefits of the crime drop have gone to the most disadvantaged segments of the population, so have the greatest costs. And those costs have come in the form of aggressive or violent policing, come in the form of intense surveillance by the state. They've come in the form of mass incarceration. So once we acknowledge this, then we're left with two questions. And the first question is, if violence is as important as I'm arguing, then what can we do to extend the fall of violence so that it reaches every neighborhood and every city across the country, particularly those places where we've seen a recent increase? So that's the first question. But then the second question is, how do we do that with a new approach? How do we do that with an approach that doesn't rely as heavily on the police and the prison system? And those are the kind of the two questions that I grapple with in the last few sections of the book, which focus on policy. And so I'm not going to go through my policy recommendations here, but I'll give you the basic principle that underlies all of them. The basic idea, and this is explored in more depth in the last few chapters of the book, is that for the past 50 years, our idea about how to deal with violence has been guided by the idea of punishment. That's been the primary goal that has driven most of our policy discussions for the past 50 years, okay? I want to make the case that we are now in a position, and this is supported by the best evidence available, to shift that discussion toward one that focuses on investment. And so that's kind of a to many in the room, that's probably an obvious suggestion, but it's actually crucial to thinking about how we can confront violent crime. It means that instead of thinking purely about the criminal justice system, about the level of incarceration in the country, when we think about how to deal with violent crime, we should be thinking about the types of investments and the objects of these investments, the groups which we should be investing in to control violence. So I argue for investments in police departments. I think police departments need new resources to rethink how they do their job, to play different roles within communities, to move to a position where they're still targeting resources on this very small number of people who account for most violence and the very small number of places that are most vulnerable to violence, but that most of the police department's resources are devoted to building relationships, to working closely with residents, to working closely with community organizations to confront violence. I think that merits new resources, okay? I think that merits new investment in police departments. Beyond police departments, I argue for large-scale investments in the people and the organizations who have always had the greatest capacity to control violence, and that's residents and organizations in the neighborhoods hit hardest by violence, okay? We've known for a long time that people in the neighborhoods hit hardest by violence have the greatest capacity to control it, okay? But these organizations and these people have never gotten the commitment from the state, from private philanthropy to do so, okay? So those are the types of shifts that I'm talking about. That's the basic principle, a shift from a goal of punishment to a goal of investment. I think I'm going to stop there. I want to take questions. I'm not going to give away everything that's in the book, but I gave away the kind of key principle behind the policy discussion. But I want to hear what you all have to say as well. So let me first apologize because I have an 8:00 a.m. course that I have to teach tomorrow. So I'm not going to be able to do the usual signing and hanging out and discussing after. But I would, while in the time I'm here, I'd love to have a conversation about this. Thanks.
Thanks for your very interesting talk. My question is, what is the relationship, do you think, between the extremely high mass incarceration rates that happened just preceding and during the peak on violent crime today in the U.S.?
Yeah, tough question. So we've got some experts in the room who might have some answers. I'm looking in John Loeb's direction, but I'll give my shot, and then you can give your take. So I think the rise of incarceration contributed to the fall of violence. There are debates about kind of when, so incarceration has been rising since the early 1970s and continued to rise and actually, accelerated in the 1990s. Only recently, in the past few years, has started to level off and fall a little bit. But we still have almost 7 million Americans who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system, either in jails, prisons, parole, probation. So the evidence, as I read it, suggests that the buildup of the incarcerated population had an impact on crime. It reduced crime. The big question is when and how much. By when, I mean there's some recent reports that have suggested that since the 1990s, the acceleration of the imprisonment probably didn't have much of an effect. The people who were going to jail and prison at that point were people who were being rounded up by a overzealous system and were not the most violent or the most risky segment of the population. How much is probably the bigger question. So I think most people who study this acknowledge that there was an effect of the rise in incarceration on crime. Estimates range from, it accounted for 10% of the effect up to 25% of the effect. So I think the overall, most people who study this suggest that there is an effect, probably is not a huge effect, and it probably wasn't worthwhile to keep incarcerating people in the 1990s when the scale just exploded. And that's excluding the discussion about the moral question, which I'm going to leave to the side here. Does that seem about right?
Hi. Again, yeah, I would echo the same statement of appreciation for the presentation. I thought it was really great. I can sympathize with the ambivalence you must have felt when you've gotten so into the importance of violence, and then at the same time finding that in some sense, practically speaking, it's a problem that's declining.
Yeah.
And I also appreciated your methodical sort of method for looking at the whole thing and sort of, here's the question though. At the end, you make this sort of switch. You think we need new methods now. It's kind of intuitively attractive to think that, well, less tough policing, rather than continuing on and making the policing even tougher and tougher and tougher, which by some simplistic thought might say, well, heck, if it's working, why not continue to use the same approach? But you're concluding something other than that, and beyond just sort of an instinctive or intuitive rationale for that. Do you have, is there good research that would say, yeah, we do need to change the method now. Maybe we've locked up the bad actors, and now we really need to focus on the community. Is there a good data and evidence that can support that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the moral answer is more important than the empirical answer, but the moral answer is that the costs that have come with that, I think, are too great and have been too targeted on non-white communities, particularly low-income communities of color. So it has amplified racial inequality instead of ameliorating it, I think, the way that we've relied so heavily on the police and the prison system. The empirical answer is more difficult. I think most progressives who will talk about this stuff will say that actually we have great evidence that building trust and forming relationships is more effective than cracking down. And I think there's an empirical basis for that, but I don't think it's as much of a slam dunk conclusion as you might hear. So we have examples of programs of where law enforcement is working with residents to focus on specific places and problem areas within communities. Typically comes under the name of problem-oriented policing that has been shown to be extremely effective. There's a larger literature that focuses on how law enforcement works to build trust and legitimacy. And that literature is very well developed. And really makes a strong case that people follow the law if they feel like it's fair, if they feel like they're being treated respectfully and fairly. So there is an empirical basis for that. I don't think we know enough about the other approach. How much did stopping every kid in New York City actually reduce crime? 700,000 kids were stopped in 2011, most of them frisked. Almost none of them had a gun. Very few of them were arrested. So we know the damage that does in terms of the legitimacy of the police, in terms of alienating and marginalizing an entire segment of the city. I don't think we have great evidence on the actual impact that had on crime. And everything I say, I'm going to look to John to just see if this is right or I don't know. What do you think, John? We have an expert in the room. I want to. Well, I think they were on the path toward improvement because of large-scale protest. Not as much because crime was falling, but because of the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the realization that brought to much of America that something had to change. I think since November of last year, things haven't kept progressing.
Got a question over here. Do you have any sense of what's going on in Baltimore? It seems that the governor was accused of importing stop and frisk to Baltimore, lost African-American support in the election, and the situation up there now seems to be as worse as ever. They just canned the police commissioner over the weekend.
Yeah. So my best guess is that's a signal about why things aren't working in Baltimore. When city government the police department and community organizations and residents are not working together and don't trust each other, that tends to be a signal that things are going to go badly in that place. And that's a very vague answer, but that in the cities where we haven't seen a fall of violence, I think that's a pretty common feature, that we have a dysfunctional city government, police department, social service sector, nonprofit sector that are not working, and that's certainly the case in Baltimore.
It's been the same city government up there for decades.
Well, I mean, they've fired the police commissioner, for no apparent reason last week. Right. I'm not saying it's a bad decision. I don't know, but that means there's an absence of leadership. That means something's going wrong in that relationship.
Let me thank you also for a quite interesting conversation and presentation. I'm not from America, I'm from the Caribbean, but I grew up in the Netherlands, where I went to University of Utrecht Law School and studied criminology there too, so I'm quite aware of what you're talking about.
You as well.
So the issue is, I'm a little bit, let me say the first thing that I want to say first, because it's important, right? I think we have to be very careful putting too much emphasis on the collapse of crime via policing and prisons, because that reinforces a kind of negative idea. And it's an idea, if you're reasonably well off, hey, I'm not going to jail. I could do practically anything. What did Trump say? He could walk down Wall Street killing people and they were the voting men, which might be correct. The issue is how to change policing, right? Because at a certain point in time in United States history, we're talking now the end of the 1900s towards the 20th century, you had, at a certain point, significant amount of women in police. And we know that the women in police tend to polarize, and also they tend to be more negotiating, right? And kind of nearly like a civil servant type of thing, a social worker type of attitude in policing, right? My wonder is if you could change, the problem is policing has become professionalized, law and order, right, militaristic. To move them back to a kind of much more problem-solving type of thing is going to create problems within. But I think it's absolutely correct, right, that policing often is the first person in areas. They go in areas where mostly the politicians don't go. They can. One of my ideas is that the police write not only a police report, but they write like a social kind of welfare report. Like, hey, we're going down here, we see a lot of young kids hanging out here, right? This raises question. We see the lights out, we see a lot of empty houses, right? Maybe you guys need to do something higher up, right? Yeah. Maybe you need to get the housing department, education, healthcare, everything together, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is the issue of how to come up with new basic, the theories you're playing with. In my day, there was at University of, and we were quite influenced by that school. University of Berkeley had a criminal justice program there under, I think the name of the people were the Schrodingers, right? And they were what called radical criminologists, right? And their notion of criminology was basically crime is criminal, poverty is crime, discrimination is crime. You understand where I'm going here, right? That there are certain societal problems that have to be criminalized, right? So that they become, in essence, the center of focus going forward. So I would like to know what you think about these ideas and to see if you are thinking along those lines. I got a sense that you might be thinking along those lines, but thank you.
Thanks for the question. On that, let me touch that last piece first. Yeah, so I always talk about violence instead of crime, and at the end of the book, I talk about the next war on violence to explicitly to distinguish it from war on crime. Not only because of the baggage that has come with that term, but also because it hopefully evokes a different set of responses. It evokes responses that focus on dealing with the broader problem of urban inequality, allowing new actors to play a larger role beyond the police and the prison system. On the first question, so I didn't touch on this, but I want to be clear that my argument about why crime fell is not about the police and the prison system. I mean, those are pieces of what happened. But the argument about why crime fell, which I didn't discuss, but which is chapter 3 of the book, makes the case that urban space transformed in the 1990s, and it transformed when crime was seen as a national crisis for the first time in a long time. The changes that took place involved the acceleration of incarceration, involved cracking down on open-air drug markets, more intensive policing. Those were part of the things that happened. But it also involved a proliferation of community organization against violence that doesn't get credit in debates about why crime fell. But when you look at the data, in the 1980s, the nonprofit sector was starved. In the 1990s, the nonprofit sector exploded. Okay, and so there were a couple hundred groups, nonprofit groups, focusing on violence before the 1990s. That number just mushroomed in the 1990s. People and organizations in the neighborhoods hit hardest by the explosion of violence, mobilized on a large scale, and it's a crucial part of the answer to why crime started to fall. It's not the only part, So when I make this case, there are changes that we might think of as positive, some that we might think of as very negative, but together I argue that they transform public space, and that's why crime started to fall.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the investment recommendation. So you say investment instead of punishment, and I'm excited to hear you say that, because then I think you're going to sort of articulate your New Deal approach to handling crime and violence. And I'm surprised to hear that some of the sort of elements that I often think about you didn't mention. I wonder if you talk about them in the book or not, or if you could tell us what you think about programs to reduce residential racial segregation, investment in healthcare, access to healthcare, investment in education, and does that tie into the kind of community organizing? Were those the kinds of demands that these community organizers were making? And then my second part of my question, I'll try to keep it short, is when you talk about the ideal of policing that you were describing, can that happen as long as there's a drug war, as long as there's stop and frisk happening, and these other kinds of policing tactics that seem to be at odds with developing with community relationships?
Yeah, great question. So on the first one, I wrote a version of this book that was just about done in September or October of last year, and then the election happened and I had to rewrite the entire end of the book because I made this large-scale case for the need to confront urban inequality, to go beyond violence and to develop a new model to deal with urban inequality, and to focus on education and housing and healthcare and the things you were mentioning. And I rewrote it not because I think it's wrong, but because it's so far from where we are. And even during the Obama administration, there was great hope that this would be a time when we would really focus on the issues of urban poverty when he came into office. And it didn't happen. Okay, the closest we got was the Recovery Act, which was this massive infusion of funding in the neighborhoods across the country, but it shared the feature with almost all of our urban policies over time, and that it was temporary. Okay, it was a temporary influx. So anyway, that's why I'm not talking about that stuff. I lay out a local agenda here because I thought it was the responsible. I did it reluctantly, but I did not want to lay out a grand agenda and then sit and pretend it's going to happen. So I laid out a local agenda that's driven by city governments. We have very competent mayors across the country. We have a very active nonprofit sector right now. One byproduct of rising inequality is that we have philanthropists who give away a lot of money. And when you think about the scale at which they're giving that money away, it dwarfs anything happening at state or federal government. So I hate that. It drives me nuts, but that's how I wrote the last few chapters. Your second question on what can we hope from police departments. What I've seen in New York has given me lots of hope. So the program that I talk about in some depth here, one of several examples, but the one that's most inspiring to me is called Neighborhood Stat. And it was dreamed up by Liz Glazer, who was the smartest city government worker that I've ever been in contact with. And she dreamed up, and it takes place in the CompStat room which is this, legendary room where the NYPD has planned how to deal with small-scale trends in crime since the 1990s. Neighborhood Stat is driven by the same principle, but it involves community residents community leaders, leaders of the Tenants Association, the social service providers in a community, and we all come together with the representatives from the police department and a new breed of officer called neighborhood coordination officers, whose job is not to enforce, but is to build relationships. And so all these people come together, and we put data and maps up on the monitors the same way the CompStat puts statistics and maps of crimes, and we look at where are the problems in this specific community, what has changed, and then each meeting ends with action steps about who's going to do what. Department of Sanitation is there, so if there's a pile of trash outside one of the housing developments, they get red in the face and are embarrassed publicly and or have to commit to a timeline as to when that's going to be taken care of, because it's an eyesore in the community. It's a sign of disorder in the community. So that's the most hopeful thing that I've seen, and I'll leave it there because I talk about it in more depth in the book.
Just so you know, this will be the last question. We're about 1 minute away from 7:45. Sorry.
Okay. Just to be quick, could you clarify your stance on the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of prisons in reducing violence? Because rudimentary thinking would make it seem you take violent actors and you put them in a prison. It's not reducing violence, it's just transferring it to another location. Does that... How does that...
Yeah, I think the best evidence suggests that to the degree that incarceration has an impact on crime, it's through incapacitation, taking people off the streets. And so that, I don't argue that it's a sustainable response, but I think if we're having an honest conversation, it did have an impact on crime rates. It's not a just solution, it's not a sustainable solution, but I do think, at least from the evidence I've seen, it did contribute. It was one contributing factor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for coming. I'm very grateful.